In the spring of 1986, an investigator parked his car in front of a small home in upstate New York where a deadly fire had broken out and killed his friend. The fire had long been extinguished, but the investigator was there now to try to figure out what had caused it. When the investigator entered the house, his eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe how extensive the damage was. When he made his way into the bedroom, where the fire had apparently started and where his friend had died, what he saw there sent a chill down his spine and confirmed that this was no ordinary fire. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Even though we rarely think about it, it is truly a miracle how well our bodies work, basically all of the time, and without any real effort from us. But sometimes, our perfect-seeming systems do break down, and when that happens, we turn to modern medicine to both diagnose our issue and fix it for us. However, there are very rare cases of people's bodies breaking down where their symptoms are so bizarre, so mysterious, so dumbfounding that no one, including the best medical experts out there, can figure out what is wrong or how to go about treating them. And on this show, these rare medical cases will be our focus. Every week, we'll explore a new baffling medical mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you liked today's story, please invite the follow button to go to a movie with you and offer to bring the snacks. But only pack room temperature filet-o-fish sandwiches. This week's story is called Ashes to Ashes. Kendall Mott kept his eyes locked on the road as he drove towards the home of his father, 58-year-old George Mott. It was 6 p.m. on March 26, 1986, and the sun was hanging low in the sky over Crown Point, which is a small country town in upstate New York. A few hours earlier, 32-year-old Kendall had received a phone call from his sister Kimberly. She had called their dad multiple times over the course of that day, but all she kept getting was his answering machine, so Kimberly was worried. Part of that worry came from the fact that their dad lived alone since he had divorced their mom a few years back. On top of that, his health was declining. George was an ex-smoker, and now he had some serious issues with his lungs. He used an oxygen mask, and he'd just recovered from a bout of pneumonia that had sent him to the hospital for a few days. Kimberly was afraid their dad might have fallen or passed out, or maybe even something worse. She knew it would be somewhat convenient for Kendall to stop by their dad's place on his way home from work, so she called him and begged him to go by and make sure their dad was okay. And of course, Kendall had said yes. But as Kendall drove through the woods down a lonely 2-lane road, he really wasn't too worried. He had visited with their dad at his house 2 days earlier. George was taking his medications and was in good spirits considering all the issues he'd been dealing with. Kendall was sure there was a reasonable explanation for why George wasn't answering his phone. Maybe George's friends picked him up and took him to a local diner called the Wagon Wheel, where Kendall knew they liked to hang out. If that was the case, then Kendall knew he wouldn't be gone for very long, and so Kendall planned to just wait inside the house until his dad came home, and then once he was back and he knew he was okay, Kendall would call Kimberly and everything would be fine. And regardless of if there was a problem or not with his dad, Kendall was happy to pop by because he was close with his dad. His dad used to be a firefighter, and he was very devoted to his profession. He spent long hours at the station away from the family, but since his retirement a few years ago, he was much more present in the lives of Kendall, Kimberly, and their children. And that really made Kendall happy. A few minutes later, Kendall pulled off the main road and began making his way down a long driveway that wound between tall maple trees. George lived in a tiny one-bedroom house in a sparsely populated area about 4 miles west of town. It was very peaceful and quiet and green out there. The nearest neighbor lived about a half-mile away. At the end of the driveway, Kendall parked his car a few feet away from his dad's house. He hopped out and then walked up to the front door. But as he got closer, he noticed that the windows near the front door looked a little bit different. They had a dark tint to them, kind of like the windows on a limousine. Kendall thought that was very strange, and he figured he would investigate once he got inside. And so Kendall got up to the front door and he knocked, but his dad didn't come to the door. And so Kendall reached down and tried the doorknob, and right away he felt two things. One, he felt the doorknob was already unlocked, and two, most importantly, he noticed the doorknob was hot to the touch. And immediately a bolt of fear shot through Kendall, because a hot doorknob could mean there was a fire raging inside the house. And so Kendall immediately whipped open the door and looked inside, but there was no fire. In fact, the house was totally quiet and nearly pitch black. Kendall instinctively reached over and flipped the light switch, but the lights didn't turn on in the house. Even worse, there was this thick, dark haze hanging in the air that was impossible to see through. It smelled a little like smoke, but it also had this strange, sweet odor to it that made it much more unsettling. Everything Kendall was experiencing just felt totally dangerous. Whatever was going on here, Kendall knew it had to be bad, especially given the fact that his dad had lung issues. Breathing in whatever was in the air could not be good for him. So Kendall stepped into the front living room and yelled out for his dad, but there was no reply. Kendall felt his way through the furniture in the living room towards the back of the house to the bedroom where his dad slept, but when he got there, again, he just couldn't see anything. Kendall was really starting to panic now. He was desperate to get his hands on a flashlight, but he didn't have one, and he didn't have one in his car, and so Kendall turned, sprinted outside, got into his car, and sped over to the house next door to see if the neighbor had a flashlight. Luckily, the neighbor was home, and they did have a flashlight, and so after explaining what was going on, the two of them raced back over to George's house with this flashlight. But when Kendall arrived back at his dad's front door, he stopped. He was holding out hope that his dad was not home, and that he was safe, and that whatever was going on inside of his house had nothing to do with his dad. But Kendall also realized that now that they had this flashlight, when the neighbor went in there and shined it around, he might reveal something totally horrible to Kendall. And suddenly Kendall, standing there right in front of the door, he just felt like he couldn't handle that. He couldn't go in and see whatever happened to his dad. So Kendall stayed outside as the neighbor clicked on his flashlight, pulled the collar of his t-shirt up over his nose and mouth, and stepped into the house. The next few minutes were agonizing for Kendall as he waited to hear what was hidden beneath the black haze inside his father's home. Finally, the neighbor emerged from the house, and from the grim expression on the man's face, Kendall could tell something horrible had happened. Within the next hour, the house was filled with inspectors from the local police and fire departments, and all of them were deeply confused by the scene laid out before them. It didn't take them long to determine that a fire had broken out inside of George's house, but the way the fire behaved just didn't make sense. As the inspectors stepped through the front door and into the living room, they could see that there was a layer of black soot covering everything. But nothing in the room was actually burnt. It was clear that it had gotten very hot inside of that house. Sitting on a table in the middle of the room were 3 pill bottles that had all melted together into one plastic clump. There was also a nail hammered into the wall, and hanging from it was the metal handle of a fly swatter. But the flat plastic square that actually swats the flies, that part had melted off. Inspectors found other plastic objects in the living room that were warped or liquefied, but there was plenty of other stuff inside the house that should have melted, but for some reason didn't. There was a plastic model of an old sailing vessel that sat on the coffee table not far from the fly swatter and pill bottles, but it looked as good as new. There was also a stack of cassette tapes that sat next to the stereo that looked unaltered and ready to be played. The right side of the living room opened out into a small kitchen. George had decorated the sides of the refrigerator with colorful wallpaper, and that paper showed 0 signs of burning. But inside the refrigerator was a totally different story. The butter was completely melted, along with the plastic butter dish. In the meat drawer was an unopened package of hot dogs, and they were all cooked. The inspectors struggled to comprehend what actually happened. How could a refrigerator turn into an oven on the inside while the outside of it was totally unaffected by the heat? And things got even weirder as the inspectors moved to the back of the house to George's bedroom. As they stepped inside, inspectors could see the TV on George's wooden dresser was caved in on the top, where the plastic shell had melted down into itself. But the dresser it was sitting on was good as new, aside from the layer of soot that covered it. In the corner of the bedroom was George's oxygen machine. Not only was it undamaged by the heat, it was still running when the inspectors arrived. Resting on top of that machine was George's plastic oxygen mask. Unlike the television, the mask had not melted. This was made all the more strange because the mask and the machine were just inches from the bed, where clearly an intense fire had raged within the last day. Now the fire was out, leaving behind a scorched, tangled mess. The wooden bed frame was charred in places, but it was still standing up. The mattress, however, was totally destroyed. The stuffing was all burnt up, and the net of metal mattress springs were melted in a way that made them curve down into a V shape under the bed. You could actually see through those springs and underneath the bed, where a large hole had burned through the floorboards. But as the inspectors crouched down to take a closer look into that hole, they could see that something else had burned up in this strange fire. Tangled in the mattress springs was a man's foot, burned off near the ankle. Near the headboard was a charred fragment of a human skull. Beyond that, they found tiny piles of fine black ash in the wreckage of the bed, as well as in the crawl space beneath the floorboards. Those ashes, along with the foot and the skull fragment, were all that remained of Kendall's father, George Mott. Before he died, George was a pretty big, sturdy guy, weighing in over 180 pounds. What was left of him now weighed about 3 pounds, easily fitting inside a shoebox. The confusion amongst the inspectors only continued to grow after finding George. George wasn't just burned. He essentially had been cremated. Cremation is the process where a dead body is burned to ashes, and it requires an immensely hot fire that burns inside of a special oven. Yet somehow, here George was, reduced to ash by this bizarre fire that only affected small portions of the house. It just didn't add up. If the temperature in the bedroom was hot enough to cremate George, how on earth was the house even still standing? But there was yet another mystery hanging over the scene. How did a fire as powerful as this one get ignited in the first place? The inspectors checked the electrical outlets, they checked the gas lines that ran in the crawl space under George's bedroom, they completely dismantled the gas furnace that straddled the bedroom and the living room, and they could not find a single shred of physical evidence that might explain how George caught on fire. A few days later, the New York State police inspectors finally just gave up. They couldn't see any signs that foul play had occurred, so they filed a final report that simply stated that George's death was, quote, accidental. Then they closed the book on the case. But there was one inspector with the Essex County Fire Department who wasn't ready to give up so fast. That man's name was Tony Moret. Tony was 37 years old and had worked in the fire department since he was 16. He had known George Mott personally, they'd worked side by side as firemen, and Tony really liked George. So he was determined to find out what really happened to his friend. On top of all the weird anomalies they found at the scene of the fire, Tony was puzzled by one more thing. He knew George was obsessed with fire safety. Tony just couldn't believe that George would be careless enough to accidentally set himself on fire. But after hundreds of hours exploring every possibility for what could have happened to George, he was getting really frustrated. Tony knew a lot about the science of fire, but none of those scientific rules seemed to apply to what he was observing inside of George's house. Finally, one of Tony's colleagues gave him a tip about an organization down in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania that might be able to help. They were called Parascience International, and they specialized in the study of strange phenomena that couldn't be explained by traditional science. Tony was hesitant at first. When he thought of the paranormal, he thought of things like Bigfoot and UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster. To him, any organization that believed in those sorts of things was an organization he couldn't really take seriously. But he was desperate to find out what happened to George, and his own investigation had reached a dead end, and so he didn't really have anything to lose by considering a different perspective, even if it was totally unorthodox. So, in April of 1986, a few weeks after George's ashes were discovered, Tony took a deep breath, then picked up the phone and made the call to Parascience International. When the phone rang 400 miles away in Harrisburg, it was answered by a man named Larry Arnold. Larry was a 37-year-old school bus driver during the day, but in his off time, he devoted many hours to this group of parascience experts. For the last 10 years, Larry had worked with them to investigate many strange and unusual events. But Larry's greatest passion was studying fire phenomena that defied explanation. So, when Tony told Larry what he needed help with, Larry was immediately interested. Larry listened intently as Tony flooded him with details about the strange case of George Mott. The body reduced to fine ash, the lack of damage to things near the body, the inexplicable pattern of melting and burning throughout the house. The more Larry heard, the more intrigued he became. And so, by the end of this call, Larry said he'd be happy to drive up to Crown Point, examine George's house, and see if he could make any sense of it. And a few weeks later, that's just what Larry did. When he arrived in Crown Point, he met with Tony at George's home. It had been over a month since the fire, but George's family was still in shock and were totally undecided about what to do with the house, so the inside really wasn't all that different from the way the inspectors first found it. As soon as he stepped through the door and into the living room, Larry noticed that the shelves and the tabletops all had a strange glaze on them. It wasn't just soot or ash that you could brush away with your hand. It was almost like baked on, like melted caramel. Right away, a picture began to form in Larry's mind of what could have happened the day George caught on fire. And so Larry headed straight to the back of the house and into George's bedroom. George's remains had been removed, but Larry could still see the area that had burned and how it hadn't spread beyond the bed and the hole in the floorboards. Larry, like every other inspector who had been inside of George's home, couldn't find anything nearby that could have possibly ignited the blaze, but to Larry Arnold, that actually wasn't the least bit surprising. Tony and the other investigators had never seen anything as confounding as this case, but Larry had. It was extremely rare, but in his research for Parascience International, Larry had uncovered about 200 recorded cases that were similar to George Mott's. For example, in the year 1725, a Parisian innkeeper found his wife had burned down to a pile of ashes in the middle of their kitchen floor. Nothing around her was damaged from this fire, not even the wooden cooking utensils that laid close to her charred remains. In 1951, a landlady visited one of the tenants of her apartment building in St. Petersburg, Florida. When she grabbed the doorknob, she found it hot to the touch, and when she opened the door, she found the tenant's body had been incinerated into ashes, except for her skull and one of her feet. Inches away from the body was a pile of newspapers that showed no signs of burning. Another example, in 1970, an 89-year-old widow was found burnt down into a pile of ashes in her home in Dublin, Ireland. The only recognizable remains were her 2 feet, which were burnt off near the ankles. She had a vase with plastic flowers sitting on a table in the center of the room. The flowers had melted into a puddle, but everything else in the room appeared to be more or less untouched. In nearly all of these similar cases, Larry noted the same common threads. There was often a strange, sweet smell reported, and a weird, ashy glaze that seemed to coat everything. There was very little damage to the space surrounding the burned remains, and there was no clear indication of what could have possibly ignited the blaze in the first place. For hundreds of years, scientists and scholars had been developing theories behind how these strange fire events could happen, and the only feasible explanation they could come up with was that these intense fires were actually ignited from inside the bodies of the victims. Back in the 1800s, many believed this was God's judgment delivered to those who led an immoral life. Some thought it could be a byproduct of alcoholism. with the excess alcohol increasing the body's flammability. As the decades passed, many other theories have also been put forward to explain how a human body that is 60% water could spontaneously ignite. Larry Arnold had his own theories. He knew the human body was full of electrical activity that pulsed through the brain, the nervous system, and through every heartbeat, so what if the electricity somehow got amplified? Could the body start an explosive electrical fire that burnt itself out from the inside? Could it burn fast enough and hot enough that it incinerated the victim without burning anything nearby? Whatever the cause, this strange and rare event eventually became so widely known that it got its own name: spontaneous human combustion. When Tony heard Larry's theory, he thought it sounded crazy, but he also thought it made more sense than any other explanation he'd heard for what happened to George. By the time Tony officially finished his own investigation into the death of George Mott, he concluded that the cause was spontaneous human combustion. But despite Tony's support of this theory, the official reports by police never changed for George Mott. His death is still listed as accidental, with no mention of spontaneous human combustion. While there are many believers in the theory, the vast majority of scientists dismiss spontaneous human combustion as pseudoscience that is unsupported by physical evidence. And the physical evidence in this case is still contradictory and confusing. But despite not fully understanding what happened, for instance, why the outside of George's refrigerator was untouched while the hot dogs inside were cooked through, Larry felt confident in his conclusion that George Mott was indeed a victim of spontaneous human combustion. According to the wishes of George's family, his ashes were sent to a crematorium, along with his foot and what was left of his skull. Then, after that second burning, George Mott was scattered at sea and finally laid to rest. In the summer of 1998, 32-year-old Catherine Gordon sat curled up on the couch with a book inside of her home in Atlanta, Georgia. Across the living room, her husband lifted their newborn baby, Jade, out of the bassinet and carried her toward Catherine to breastfeed. It should have been a sweet moment. Catherine thought about how amazing it was that she actually had a baby. It wasn't that long ago that she was a self-described party girl who thought more about the next bikini contest she could enter than about having a child of her own. But now, the former model, who once moonlighted as a bartender, was a stay-at-home mother with a husband in law school. They were now the model of respectability, and their little baby Jade completed their perfect little family. But Catherine didn't think being a mom would hurt so much. Every time Jade latched onto her breast for milk, Catherine felt a burning sensation tear through her chest. It hurt so much she could feel tears welling up in her eyes. Her husband, John, had tried to reassure her that a lot of new moms experienced difficulties with breastfeeding, and Catherine wanted to believe him. Maybe she was still learning how to do it right. Catherine cupped her hand around the soft, warm fuzz of Jade's head and guided her from John's hands to her breast. The baby tilted her face up to stare at her mother as she began to nurse. Catherine started to smile at Jade's big round eyes, but then she noticed her baby's lips. They were bright red, covered in blood. A bolt of fear shot through Catherine, and she pulled Jade off her breast to get a closer look. It didn't look like the blood was coming from Jade's mouth. Instead, it seemed to be coming from Catherine's milk ducts. She was relieved the baby was okay, but what in the world was going on with her? She called for John and jumped up from the couch to hand him their baby. Then she called her doctor and said she needed an appointment right away. The nurse said she could squeeze her in the next day. By the next morning, Catherine was exhausted. She'd barely slept the night before, between waking up for the baby and also worrying about what was happening with her breasts. If it wasn't for the pain in her chest, she might have fallen asleep right there. But her doctor, the same OBGYN who had delivered Jade a month earlier, could not have been kinder. She asked Catherine questions about her pain and carefully examined her breast to pinpoint where the pain was coming from. She also had Catherine produce some milk for analysis in the lab. Then she smiled and explained that Catherine had mastitis, a bacterial infection that targets breast tissue, causing it to swell. The swelling put pressure on Catherine's milk ducts, which led to the pain Catherine felt when she fed Jade. It also led to the bleeding. Mastitis is a very common illness that affects many new mothers, and it's easy to fix with antibiotics. The doctor promised that once Catherine finished taking the medication for 10 days, she'd be back to normal. Catherine exhaled in relief, but something was still bothering her that she needed to share. She told the doctor that 10 years ago, she had gotten breast implants while she was working as a swimwear model in Virginia Beach, Virginia. At the time, Catherine had been excited to get them. They gave her such a full figure that she won beauty contests all over the region. But now, Catherine wondered if the procedure could have caused any problems with breastfeeding her baby. The doctor promised Catherine the infection had nothing to do with the implants. This seemed like a totally ordinary case of mastitis, and she was sure Catherine would feel better after taking the antibiotics. Catherine thanked the doctor and headed home to tell John, hopeful that she would soon feel better. Three days after Catherine finished her course of antibiotics for her mastitis, she and John sat down to a big meal that she'd prepared. Catherine was feeling great and had put Jade down to sleep with no problems earlier in the evening. The antibiotics had taken away all the pain from breastfeeding, and she'd even felt good enough to go to the gym earlier in the week. It was rare these days that Catherine and John got to spend time alone, and now John was very eager to tell his wife about his busy day. Besides attending law school, John also managed a chain of restaurants and bars, so he was juggling a lot. He had always been a type A personality, never satisfied unless he had a new challenge. Catherine had worked hard too, both as a model and then also a sales rep, but now she was content to look after their home and be with the baby. She sometimes thought that there was something a little invisible about being a stay-at-home mom, but she still cherished this time with Jade, even if she did sometimes feel like she was just her husband's cheerleader. A few minutes into dinner, Catherine began to feel extremely tired. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was only 8 o'clock, and normally she was still full of energy at this time. She tried her best to ignore the fatigue and concentrated as best as she could on what John was saying about his constitutional law class. She told herself that, long days with Jade were exhausting, and probably she just needed more sleep. But when Catherine and John finished eating their meals and they stood up to clear the table, Catherine felt so lightheaded that she immediately sat back down before she fell. As she sat there collecting herself, Catherine realized that her muscles were beginning to ache too. And so she hoped she wasn't now coming down with the flu right when she was finally cured of mastitis. John rushed over to her and asked her what was wrong. Catherine didn't want to alarm him, so she smiled and said she was just tired. He squeezed her hand and told her he would clean up. She should just go to bed and get some rest. Catherine nodded and slowly got up and walked to the bedroom, hoping she'd feel back to normal in the morning. A month later, Catherine limped back into the waiting room of her OBGYN's office. She had tried for weeks to get better on her own, hoping that her healthy eating habits and drinking lots of fresh juice would speed up her recovery. But no matter what she did, it didn't help. She just kept getting worse. These days, her fatigue and aching muscles were making it so hard to get out of bed in the morning. And recently, her joints had started to feel hot and tender. Catherine now relied on a group of friends to help her care for the baby all day and make meals, while John started handling more of the house cleaning and Jade's nightly feedings. Catherine felt so guilty. She knew that her mysterious symptoms were making John's life way harder and kind of testing his patience. John was trying to be a good husband and help out around the house, but Catherine found it impossible to keep from criticizing him when he left a dirty dish in the sink or a paper out of place. Catherine couldn't help that she was a perfectionist, and she knew it totally grated on him when she asked so much of him while saying that she was just too tired and achy to keep the house organized herself. Catherine knew something was wrong, and it probably was not mastitis. She was hoping the doctor could help her figure out what was really wrong so she could start feeling like herself again. As Catherine sat on the examining table in her hospital gown, the doctor flipped through the pages of her medical chart and told her what she saw. Catherine's vital signs were normal. Her blood work was normal. She didn't have a major disease like cancer or heart disease, and she didn't have a minor one like mastitis either. In fact, as far as the doctor could see, there was nothing physically wrong with Catherine at all. Then she asked Catherine how she was feeling mentally and if everything was all right at home. Catherine admitted that things were a bit tense these days between her and John, and she explained that her fatigue was making it really hard to take care of her baby. The doctor's expression grew serious, and she sat down next to Catherine. She suspected that her fatigue was due to postpartum depression, a condition that often afflicts new mothers and can be treated with counseling or antidepressants. Catherine was stunned. She did not feel depressed. If she was struggling emotionally, it was only because of her physical discomfort, not the other way around. She told the doctor that when she looked down at Jade and saw her baby smile, she knew that Jade was the best thing in her life. She just needed to get back in good physical shape so she could be the mother she always wanted to be. But the doctor made it clear that Catherine had it wrong. She was confident that the best way for Catherine to get better was to be treated not by her, not by the doctor's office, but by a therapist. Catherine always considered herself the kind of person who speaks up for herself. If someone didn't take her seriously, it made her angry, and she often said so. But this time, as a tired new mom in a hospital gown that didn't quite cover her back, Catherine just fell silent. She thanked the doctor for her concern and then just got up and left. The next day, Catherine was at home playing with Jade on a mat next to the couch. She was dressed in her workout clothes and waiting for a babysitter to arrive. Even though she still felt achy and exhausted basically all of the time, she was determined to get back to the gym. She'd felt good working out while she recovered from mastitis, so she hoped that some gentle exercise would help her get her body back under control. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Catherine let in the babysitter and kissed Jade goodbye. Then she slowly headed out to her car to drive to the gym. Once she got there, the familiar sounds of clattering gym equipment and people working out boosted Catherine's spirits. She felt a surge of energy just watching everyone else lift weights and pedal stationary bikes. Catherine took some deep breaths and carefully stepped onto a treadmill. She set the machine to a moderate walking pace and started out slowly, savoring the feeling of movement after weeks of basically being inactive. She told herself it was mind over matter, but after a few minutes, she felt a tingling sensation in her legs and a shooting pain running down her left arm. Catherine kept walking and tried to ignore the pain, but it was no use. Her body was screaming at her to stop. So eventually she pushed the stop button on the treadmill and headed to a bench. She sat down and began massaging her muscles, but that didn't help. Catherine shook her head in frustration. She had barely begun to work out, and now she was already in so much pain that she needed to grab her gym bag and head home. But when she stood up to leave, she felt yet another strange sensation, an intense itching, and it was coming from inside of her chest. Because Catherine could not literally itch the inside of her chest, she reflexively just began tapping on the middle of her chest with her hand, but the itching feeling didn't go away. And so Catherine tapped harder, and then finally she made a fist and just started banging on her chest. But she still felt this unbearable tingling sensation rising up under her skin. Other people now were staring at her as she pounded away madly at her chest. Finally, she dropped her fist in embarrassment when she realized everybody was staring at her, and then as quick as she could, she grabbed her things and headed out of the gym back to her car. Catherine felt helpless. Her whole body seemed to just be falling apart. She knew she needed more help. Maybe a different doctor would have a better diagnosis than her OBGYN, who seemed convinced that it was all in Catherine's head. As soon as Catherine got back home, she made an appointment with her primary care doctor. A few days later, Catherine sat on yet another examination table, this one in her primary care doctor's office. She described her original fatigue and muscle aches and bleeding nipples, but she made it clear her condition was really getting worse and worse. Now she was suffering from weakness and tingling in her limbs, and this weird constant itching inside of her chest. And Catherine was happy to see that her doctor was taking detailed notes as she spoke, and he had a focused, interested expression on his face. When she was finally done speaking, her doctor tapped his pen on his clipboard for a moment, and then he gave her a serious look. He told her he thought she had something called fibromyalgia, which is a disorder that causes pain and tenderness throughout the body and often results in fatigue. Scientists don't fully understand what causes it, he admitted, and there are no real tests for it either. Doctors tend to diagnose patients with the condition when they can't find another explanation for widespread chronic body aches. And although Catherine's doctor didn't actually say this to her, it is the case that doctors will sometimes default to this vague diagnosis, fibromyalgia, when they basically think it could actually all be in the patient's head, just like Catherine's OBGYN had suggested. Catherine's primary care doctor told Catherine that there's no cure for fibromyalgia. He said the best he could do was prescribe her a painkiller called OxyContin to help manage the symptoms. And so Catherine was relieved to finally hear that something was physically wrong with her, even though it was frightening to hear that there was no cure. But still, it didn't seem like all of her symptoms could be explained away by this fibromyalgia. And so Catherine asked if there were any more tests he could run, or anything he could do at all to try to figure out any of the underlying reasons behind her pain. But the doctor shook his head and said no, and then stood up to end the appointment. He said the OxyContin would help her feel better, and that was the best he could do. And so as Catherine left his office, she started to feel like, once again, a doctor was casually writing off her symptoms rather than seriously looking into the root cause. She didn't know if she believed the fibromyalgia diagnosis any more than the postpartum depression diagnosis, and she wasn't sure she wanted to start taking OxyContin, which can be very addictive. Because even if it did help mask her symptoms, she knew it wouldn't actually help cure the underlying reason behind them. She wanted a cure, not just a temporary fix. Still, Catherine was enough of a dutiful patient that she did go to the pharmacy and she picked up the 4 pill bottles that were waiting for her, just in case. 2 months later, Catherine laid on the couch, completely exhausted. She had decided to follow her intuition and not take the OxyContin, but now her symptoms were getting so much worse. The aches were deeper in her muscles, the joint pain felt hotter and sharper, the numbness, tingling, and itching inside of her chest were nearly constant. On top of that, she was getting more tired than ever. She had just put Jade to bed, and now she didn't even have the energy to make dinner. So John was heating up some leftover pizza for them to eat. Catherine eventually heard the beep of the microwave, and so she dragged herself out to the kitchen. She winced in pain as she sat at the table while John silently served them their food. Catherine could tell he was mad, but she didn't really know what to say, so she just sat there quietly while they ate, and then she got up to do the dishes. But Catherine was in so much pain that she had to grip the side of the counter for support. John watched her silently and just shook his head. Then he told her that she had been complaining of aches and weakness for months, but she refused to do anything about it. 2 doctors had given her a diagnosis, but she had just rejected both and refused to follow their advice. He was exhausted too, and at his wit's end, trying to understand what was going on with his wife. In fact, he wasn't even sure there was anything actually wrong with her. Before she could say anything, John turned and walked out of the room. Catherine stood at the counter for another minute and then stumbled to a kitchen chair and just sat there crying for what felt like hours. Finally, she stopped crying and dried her face off with a napkin and told herself that she couldn't give up yet. Maybe there was still an answer for her out there, and even if she didn't have her husband's support, she'd continue to look for answers alone. She had to keep trying for Jade. A few months later, in the spring of 1999, Catherine finally got an appointment with a rheumatologist who was an expert both on fibromyalgia and arthritis. Since that fight with John in the kitchen, Catherine had gone out and seen various other doctors, but none of them had been able to help. But now, as she waited in this latest exam room, she felt hopeful that this specialist could solve her case once and for all. After a short wait, the doctor came in. He was an older man, and although he seemed like he knew what he was doing, she didn't like the way he called Catherine honey. She decided she would forgive his sexism if he could offer her something besides addictive painkillers as a solution. And he did. The doctor began scolding Catherine for not listening to what doctors had already told her. The problem is in your head. He had reviewed her charts and, as far as he was concerned, she didn't have a disease. And until she could accept that and get herself together, her personal life would continue to suffer. Partway through the doctor's lecture, Catherine just stopped listening, like when she was getting scolded as a kid. She felt humiliated and desperate and mad. She knew there was something physically wrong with her, but she was now starting to feel her will to fight slipping away. And she knew the doctor was right about one thing. Her marriage was crumbling under the weight of her sickness. Catherine pushed herself up from her chair and silently left the office. She walked slowly to her car, having to stop periodically to lean against the wall to rest. When Catherine got home, she paid the babysitter and put Jade in the playpen in the living room. Then she lay down on the couch and watched as her little daughter crawled around the space. Jade was nearly 1 year old, and Catherine loved to see her blossoming into a little toddler. But watching from the couch also made Catherine feel guilty and totally inadequate. She wanted to play with her little girl and crawl around on the floor with her, but she just couldn't. Catherine told Jade how beautiful and special she was, but to her surprise, the words that came out of her mouth sounded funny, almost like she was drunk. She sat up straight and tried to speak normally, but again, the words that tumbled out were ragged and slow. And so Catherine thought to herself, oh my God, I can't even talk anymore. Catherine started to feel a rising sense of panic. If her symptoms got much worse, she wouldn't be able to care for her baby at all. As the sun faded, Catherine managed to feed Jade and get her to sleep. She promised herself that she would clean up the baby's mess in the living room, but first she just needed to lay back down on the couch. An hour later, the front door opened and her husband, John, walked in. Catherine was still laying on the couch, tucked underneath a blanket, and she could immediately feel her husband's disapproval as he stared at her and then also at the messy room all around her. John dropped his bag and sat down next to Catherine. He told her enough was enough. It was time to suck it up and get herself together. Catherine felt tears roll down her face, but she didn't have the energy to respond. They'd had this conversation over and over again, and it always arrived at the same place, with John not believing her, and she just did not have the energy to fight anymore. So she just laid there, letting tears stream down her face. John didn't say anything more either. After a minute, he just got up and left. As Catherine lay there alone, she felt something shift inside of her. She'd been fighting with her doctors, her husband, and her body for months. She realized that she'd gotten to the end of her rope. After 10 months of fighting, she felt hopeless, alone, and totally out of options. Catherine could not keep living like this. That night, Catherine dragged herself into the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet to get her toothbrush. Her 4 unopened bottles of OxyContin were standing on the glass shelf. She realized the pills would be more than enough to end her life. Catherine closed the cabinet, hobbled over to the bed, and crawled under the covers. As she tossed and turned, she kept thinking about those bottles of OxyContin. She looked over at John, who was sound asleep. She didn't want to leave him and Jade alone, but she just couldn't bear the pain anymore. She was done. Tonight, she would sleep beside her husband for the last time. The next day, she'd make sure Jade was with someone, and while John was at law school, she would overdose on her pills. Catherine closed her eyes, satisfied that she finally had a plan. Then she fell into a deep sleep. But as she slept, Catherine had a strange dream. A jumble of images flickered through her mind, like some broken film reel. She couldn't make sense of what they meant, and then she heard a voice. It was deep and powerful and cut through all the chaos of her dream. The voice told her that there was something poisonous growing inside of her that needed to come out. Catherine bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. The dream felt so real that suddenly she felt like she could taste poison in her mouth. Catherine suddenly knew that she had just gotten a message that could save her life. The next day, Catherine sat in the waiting room of yet another doctor's office. This time, she was meeting with a surgeon named Susan Kolb. The voice in Catherine's dream had told her that whatever this poison was in her body, it needed to come out, like be surgically removed. And Catherine was almost positive she knew what it was. Now she just needed to convince a surgeon to actually perform the surgery. Catherine described her symptoms to the surgeon for what felt like the millionth time. When she mentioned the shooting pain in her arm, Dr. Kolb stopped her. She said she'd seen those symptoms before, and they weren't caused by postpartum depression or fibromyalgia. Dr. Kolb was pretty sure she knew what was making Catherine sick. It was exactly what the voice in Catherine's dream had said it was. But there was no way to know for sure without actually doing surgery. She needed to visually confirm her diagnosis, and no amount of imaging from MRI or CT scans would be enough. She would have to cut Catherine open in the hope that she was right, exposing her to all the risks of surgery from bleeding to infection to organ damage. Catherine felt a surge of fear and also hope. The prospect of undergoing serious surgery was terrifying, but far less so than the prospect of continuing to get weaker and sicker. So she took a deep breath and told Dr. Kolb to please schedule her for the soonest available time slot. Three days later, Catherine lay on an operating table at a local hospital. Dr. Kolb stood at her side and asked if she had any last questions or doubts before they began the procedure. Catherine confirmed that she didn't, and Dr. Kolb nodded to the anesthesiologist. They stepped forward and put some drugs into Catherine's IV. Dr. Kolb waited until Catherine was in a deep sleep before reaching for her scalpel. Then she made a quick incision in Catherine's skin, revealing the fatty tissue beneath. With precise and careful strokes, she continued to cut deeper and deeper. She kept going until her knife was underneath Catherine's pectoralis major muscle, the largest muscle in the chest. There, Dr. Kolb saw what she was looking for: the round implants from Catherine's breast augmentation surgery 11 years earlier. The implants were in the right position, and they didn't appear to have any holes, which was a common problem with implants. But these were not the issues Dr. Kolb was looking for. She reached down and loosened one of the implants and then pulled it out, and immediately Dr. Kolb was shocked at what she saw. The problem was so obvious, the doctor knew right away she would not need to run any additional tests to confirm her diagnosis. The implant was supposed to be full of clear saline liquid that normally keeps it round and firm, but instead, the liquid inside of Catherine's implant was pitch black and full of tiny floating particles. Dr. Kolb quickly switched to the other side of Catherine's chest and removed the second implant, and it too was also black and full of particles. Dr. Kolb told her astonished surgical team that she had found what was making Catherine sick, and the cause was as shocking as it was unlikely. It would turn out Catherine's breast implants were full of a black mold, the same kind of fungus that grows in people's bathrooms. The contamination probably began about 10 months earlier, right after Catherine's breasts began bleeding as she was feeding Jade. She really did have mastitis then, but the antibiotics that her doctor had given her to treat it had caused a brand new problem. The drugs had cleared up the mastitis, but they did their job almost too well. They also killed healthy bacteria inside of Catherine's body that helped protect against other infections. And so as a result, Catherine soon developed this fungal infection that sneaked into her breast implants through a loose valve or seal. From there, the fungus started breeding inside of the liquid saline of the implants and began releasing a steady stream of poisonous toxins back into Catherine's body that were making her very sick. If Catherine had ignored the warning signs from her body and her powerful dream, the implants could have easily eventually burst and killed her. But she listened to the voice in that dream, and it saved her life. Dr. Kolb put Catherine on a 2-month course of a common antifungal medication called fluconazole. After it was completed, Catherine felt much better. It was a long road to recovery, but eventually, Catherine would feel totally normal. She and John were able to work through the relationship issues that manifested during her illness, and they would actually go on to write a book together about relationships. 2 months after her implants were removed, Catherine became pregnant with her son, Cole. She continues to live a healthy life with no long-term effects from her fungal infection. The FDA now requires that breast implant manufacturers include prominent boxed warnings and updated recommendations designed to detect leaks in the implants.